Welcome.
Appreciate it. Good morning. Well, it's great to be here again and to be able to share some insights, kind of looking at what you find when you start to pulse associates, especially large group of associates. As you can imagine, we were at that point in time asking one question, the Tiny Pulse way, to 160,000 associates every week for the first 6 months to set our baselines, and then, built an ongoing way of pulsing. So you can imagine that there's a ton of data. And what I want to do today is to kind of take, and Scott's talk absolutely links perfectly into this, to look at when we start to think about engagement and culture, how much of that is tied to leadership behaviors. And today we're going to focus on a behavior called continuous listening, which is not just about how we relate to people individually, but also organizationally. How do we make sure that we're listening? So let me ask you this to start with. How many of you believe that business outcomes, all the things we measure, are directly related to associate engagement and culture? Okay? When you start to think about where we spend a lot of our time and a lot of our discussion, what are we focusing on? Business outcomes, right? Okay, shareholder value, what's happening. And I'm not saying financials and those metrics aren't important, but one of the things is, if we really do believe that it's the cultures we create and how engaged our associates are, why aren't we spending more time to ensure that we have those kind of cultures that then make people want to take care of customers in a significant way? So I'm going to start with just a framework to kind of think about. And again, goes really well to what Scott said, is that in a healthy organization, you're going to see alignment in these 4 areas. That values should drive behaviors. Behaviors, and particularly leadership behaviors, then drive the culture, okay? And that if we have the right culture, again, with engaged associates, then the outcomes tend to take care of themselves. And I'm not being short-sighted to say there aren't other things that we focus on, but today really want to spend time getting you to think about behaviors and culture and how the two go together. And how can we, many of us who focus on culture and engagement, help the organization integrate those things into truly understanding and driving business outcomes, which we all have responsibility for in our roles. Now, let me ask you this. Anybody ever worked for an organization where they said their values were one thing, but the leader behaviors did not reflect the same things? All right. What's broken down already? People tell you we're one thing, and the realities become something else. And who do we look to see what the realities are? Leadership. And when you see the two don't go together, what does it do to your own engagement? Right? Down, right? Gosh, they're saying all the right things, but the behaviors don't align with the values. And to me, all of a sudden, you have eroding trust. Because when words and behavior don't go together, there's not trust, right? And then when we have the kinds of leader behaviors we need to have to drive culture and then to lead into outcomes, that again is where the framework is, and where many of us in the roles that we serve in have an opportunity to really focus by developing the behaviors, focusing on the behaviors, and looking at the outcomes. So one of the things we want to talk about is, how do you know what behaviors impact business outcomes? Well, I would say to you, when you use tools like Tiny Pulse to listen to your associates, and I'm going to talk about in a little while, listen to your customers, it is incredible. You have the data right there to know a lot of the things that you need to be focusing on. But the data by itself is not enough. Because once you have the data, and some of you who have implemented, Tiny Pulse or other things, many times will find out at the very beginning, people are so excited. You tell the leaders you're getting ready to put it in, then you put it in, and they start to get data and feedback. And I really believe that then that feedback should be leader-led, not HR-led. Do you understand what I mean? HR provides the platform, the tools, the analytics, lots of communication and information, but you will never change culture if it's not locally leader-led, right? So having leaders with the right values and the right behaviors to drive the culture become incredibly important. But many times, again, when you put that in place and you say to the leaders, this will be leader-led, and they start to get the information and data, you might hear people start to say, this is a lot of work. Have y'all heard that? This is a lot of work. And what I want to say is, gosh, think about what you're saying. To take some time every time you pulse and take that feedback and share it and communicate with it and read all those comments and figure out what you need to do about it. Really? That takes too much time? We've got it backwards. Those are the very things we should be doing because those are the things that are going to drive the business outcomes. And you have so much data right in front of you, it becomes incredibly important. All right, so values, and I'm not going to, Scott talked a lot about this, but one of the things that really becomes important is to understand that it is the values and the behavior together that then impact what our associates see, what they start to feel themselves, and what starts to become important. The behaviors are the actions that we take. Again, we can have all the right words, but in our behaviors, what do our associates see? How do they start to impact? And really, do you care about me as an individual? And when we start to look at behavior, I want you to think about this. And no matter how you gain feedback from your associates today, how many of you would say that some of the key things we continue to hear about is how we do or don't communicate, right? Do associates understand the changes that we're going through? Do we pay attention to people, again, as individuals? And all of the things, when you start to think about it, I would encourage you to consider what percentage of time every day do you spend in communication with another person? How many of you would say greater than 80%? 90%, right? So the way we communicate becomes incredibly important, and one of the things that we need to talk about that becomes really foundational is how we listen. And so we're going to spend some time talking about how do you create a culture of continuous listening. And I love this quote. The most basic and powerful way to connect to another person is to listen. Just listen. Okay? A lot of my training early in my life was as a therapist, and worked as a therapist for many years. And one of the things that becomes so basic in our training is the opportunity to help people feel understood. That you really can't help anyone unless you help them feel understood. And the second piece is that they are the ones who have the answers. It's we who support, connect, and help people find their answers by providing the kind of support and listening as a foundation. So why does listening, in a sense, become so difficult, and why would we need to be talking about something so basic? And I really believe it's because in the way that we continue to move quickly in our worlds, we're not really stopping to take the time to listen. And I will tell you, honestly, in my career, the most exciting work I've ever been involved in is this work around measuring what associates are feeling in real time. In real time. Okay, in a minute we're going to talk about if you're one of those companies like most who are going through transformational change, how can you not be listening to your associates in real time? Because asking a question or a set of questions every 18 months or once a year, what does that really say about how important it is for us to listen to associates? Right? So I'm a huge believer, and the data that I'm going to share today, just in my experience around things, supports that not only is it important to our associates, but it absolutely links to business outcomes. So we have two things I want you to think about. Many of you may be here because you're thinking about how do we listen to our associates, right? And if you're going to pulse, how are you going to do it? How often are you going to do it? What questions are you going to ask? All of those kinds of things. Well, one of the things I'd consider to you to think about is maybe one of the greatest pieces of information you can start to have is how does the way in which your associates are feeling and their level of engagement impact customer satisfaction? And what we started to do in the past was to take the information we were getting from associates was so important. We were like, we need to be asking customers at the same time. So we started pulsing customers at the same time we were pulsing associates and have been able to kind of look at the relationship between the two and what were the drivers, the things that meant most to associates that were actually driving the outcomes that our customers would see. And I'm telling you, it is incredible to start to see the linkage between, again, how engaged an associate is and the kind of perception that your customers start to have based on their interactions, again, with your associates. So I'm going to get us to play a fun video here to look at a little bit about listening. And what I want you to think about is how often our biggest tendency is to go out and try to fix things, but we really have missed a huge step, and that's helping people feel heard, understood, and listened to. So we're going to roll this.
It's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
No, see, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See,
out.
you're not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just... Sometimes it's like... There's this achy... I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
That sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. Ow. If you would just...
Don't...
Try to see things my way. Do I have to keep on talking till I can go on?
So it's not about the nail, right? But it's truly a great opportunity to look at what it means to feel heard and understood, right? And many times, again, we want to go to what are the results? And let me just give you an example. If you pulse associates and even in open-ended comments or a question, one of the things you start to hear from associates is, you know, we would like to have better lighting in our parking lots. I'm just making up something here, right? And so you hear the feedback and you just go put lighting in the parking lots. So you heard what they said and you responded. What was the missing opportunity? To say to people, you told us that one of the things that was really important to you was to have lighting in that parking lot, and your safety is really important to us and something that we care about. So what we want you to know is in the next, I'm making up something again, 60 days, we're going to be installing lighting into the parking lot, but it's because of what you shared with us, that it's something that you value, so it should be something that we value, and it's something that we're going to attend to and respond to. If you haven't helped the person feel understood, and the group feel understood, and you go immediately to just fixing things, you have missed an incredibly important way of engaging and aligning with your associates when, again, they have the opportunity to feel heard. So when I ask you to reflect for just a second and ask you today, what engages you where you work? What comes to mind for you? And don't worry, I'm not going to go around and ask, but what comes to mind for you? And for how many of you were one of the three following things linked to what comes to mind for you? The extent to which you feel valued, the extent to which you feel recognized, and do you have an opportunity to learn and grow in your environment? And is that important to the company? Can I see some head nods? Any relationships between the three? So what I want to say to you is, when we start to think about pulsing and listening, we have the opportunity to do all of the above, right? When we pulse, it becomes our opportunity to listen to what our associates are saying and to help them feel valued. And I'm kind of sharing here what some of the elements of a learning organization do. And one of the things they do is always have mechanisms to listen, to question, to gather information. And that not only helps people feel understood, but it creates a learning organization as well, where people feel like they have the opportunity to speak up and that there are processes and ways of developing people that then support what it is that we've talked about. The biggest surprise for me when we installed TINYpulse is the following. Because I have to admit, David would probably laugh and say, initially I was like, cheers for peers. I was like, wow, really? That didn't really hit me. If you've used TINYpulse, that tool, and you know why it's part of the tool, right? Because the linkage between recognition and engagement. But in the tool, having a two-way communication where you can communicate with other people and recognize people for what they've done within the tool, you know what we found? We found that there is a huge linkage between the number of cheers that people were sending out, leaders, or numbers of cheers that they were receiving were linked to turnover. Does that surprise you? Think about this for a second. If you're really engaged, there's a greater likelihood you're going to be sending cheers and trying to engage others, right? If you become disengaged and you're just kind of going through the motions, that just might be a step that you don't take. The other thing is when people start to receive cheers and are hearing that kind of feedback, not only does that become important to them, but it becomes an indicator to you that lets you know who are the people in leadership whose behaviors are being valued. And in the TINYpulse tool, the opportunity to look, I promise you there's huge validity with this, on the leaders who are receiving and giving cheers, and those who are really impacting engagement. It'll sit out there right in front of you. You start to look at the names and the data, and you're like, wow, this makes perfect sense. And what it goes back to is it's because that person is engaged. So I wanted to kind of share with you some, again, lessons from learning. And there's a quote I love that says, listening equals learning. And the more we listen, the more we learn. So in the experience of spending time listening to a large number of associates, here are some of the key things that really became important to see. Number one, many of you are probably, no matter what industry you're in, going through significant transformational change, right? Companies that are centralizing, companies that are reinventing, like Scott talked about, every 5 years, going a different direction. Reimbursement rates may be impacting how you have to run your business. All of those different kinds of things. How can you help associates through change if you're not paying attention to what's going on with them in real time through the change process, right? Because how do you know what to address to help them through the change if you're not listening ongoing to what it is that's impacting them through the change? And you all know this. This is just a linkage, but of putting two different kinds of models together. One is what starts to happen in personal change, and the other is what happens when you start to have organizational change. And when you start to get to the bottom of the curve, and you're having significant disruption, Okay? Now, disruption, that word always throws me a little bit because it sounds so negative. Disruption, just like we saw in the Uber CEO quote or whatever, actually becomes an area of great opportunity. It's just that some can make it through the cycle because they can see the opportunity in it and others can't. But this is what I want to ask you is, how would you know how engaged your associates are if you're in the middle of major transformation and you're just asking them once a year, how's it going? When you pulse, you have the opportunity through the change cycle to see, here's an example where you take a question. Here would be one. Our leaders do a good job of helping us understand why we're making the changes that we're making, okay? Ask it 3 or 4 times during a year, 18 months, whatever your cycle is, and re-look at the question and start to see what happens. If people are moving emotionally through the change like you would want them to, or you're doing a good job of it, then most of the time what you're going to see is your score is going to go down when you hit the disruption. But once you've been communicating and helping them understand what it is that's happening and how it's going to impact them, then there's a great opportunity to watch those scores go up. Have done this several times on several key indicators, and you know what you start to find? The ones that are moving up and going, they come down, but come in the cycle, then to start moving up, that's probably not where you need to be spending your attention. But I promise you, you will find certain areas, here might be one. I understand how the changes that are being made in the organization are going to impact me as an individual. Line of sight. Right? Well, if that score stays stuck, you automatically know what your interventions need to be, right? And when we go back to leader behaviors, what do the leaders need to be focusing on is helping their associates understand what is it that's going on and how is it going to impact me? Because everyone wants to know that. And again, what I'll say to you is I am truly not a believer in the traditional surveys at all anymore by themselves. I believe you can use traditional surveys along with pulsing and really be able to get a comprehensive way of looking at things, but to have the one-time survey, we're talking to millennials who are used to getting immediate real-time feedback in everything they do, and they don't communicate like some of us who, may have been around longer. They don't communicate in the same way. So to not listen to them in an ongoing basis or whatever is just such a huge miss. But I would just say this to you, if you pulse, it gives you the opportunity to see the movement, what's impacting people, and where your leaders need to be spending time. What have we found? For sure, that continuous listening. If you really want to create a culture where continuous listening, your associates would say, again, about the culture, gosh, we get asked all the time as associates how we feel about certain things. And when that starts to get hardwired as part of your culture, I promise you, you will start to see it impact your engagement scores and participation. Listening and then paying attention to what gets said, communicating back, you will start to see a huge linkage between the two because, again, it's not a program, it's part of your culture. Employee engagement linked to business outcomes, absolutely. Relationships between employee engagement and turnover, absolutely. Huge linkage between employee engagement and financial components such as labor costs, other kinds of things, how you're staffing and how you can work, can you operate in a lean fashion? And I would say absolutely you can operate in a lean fashion if people feel valued, recognized, listened to, and you have the kind of culture where people are excited about what they're doing and it provides meaning for them. Relationship to business outcomes, again, and customer satisfaction being one of them. To take the data between what your associates are saying and linking it in real time to what's going on with your customers, there could be nothing more powerful. So in this facility over here, we have really high engagement scores and we have really strong business outcomes. But over here, we're not having really strong business outcomes, go back and look at this data in real time and see the linkage. And what do we all know? That the biggest proportion of the time, the issues are going to be around leader behaviors. And then you have the hard questions. Do we have the right leaders? If we do have leaders who we think are the right leaders, but they're not really moving the needle, do we need to be providing them coaching support or other kinds of things to be successful? But I am really, really a believer that in the pulsing and the things that we do, if you really want your leaders to know that this is important to you, take the feedback that you're getting in all of your analytics and share it transparently across all leaders. Right? We are creating a culture of continuous learning and continuous listening, and the best way we can do that is have open and transparent communication so that everybody sees where all the scores fall. If you have leaders within your organization, senior leaders who meet with other leaders to do ongoing calls around financials or outcomes or whatever, you should be looking at participation rates and engagement scores just as importantly as you look at whether or not they're hitting budget, right? Because if you just focus on the financials and business outcomes and don't take some of these things and hold leaders accountable for these things, what's your message? It's all about the dollar, right? It's all about the outcome. No, if you really believe that slide we put up at first, it's really about how we treat people, how we listen that will then drive those outcomes. And then other examples of things such as reimbursement, other kinds of things that are changing, that employee engagement can be linked to outcomes, again, related to engagement. In healthcare, for instance, we have something called HCAP scores that basically measure patient satisfaction. And that patient satisfaction and patient experience is related directly to reimbursement. Other behaviors, the ability to build, for leaders to build a team, that they care about the overall person, mind, body, and spirit, that people are recognized and receive recognition on an ongoing basis, that our associates have input into how we improve and how we do things better instead of us telling them what we're going to do, that they help tell us what we need to do. That we give transparent, consistent feedback related to performance. People want to know how they're doing, but they don't want a once a year sit down that just feels like I checked a box. They want dialogue, listening, and relational behavior skills. And this last one, helping people understand the benefits of the change you're going through, why you're doing it. Can't tell you how important that one is, helping them to continue to understand the whys and how it's going to impact them. Customer satisfaction, absolutely linked to employee engagement. Again, people feeling recognized, people feeling empowered, people starting to feel a sense of being a team, and that they are absolutely bought into the vision, mission of where the organization is going. So as you start to look at these things, again, I would just say to you, are you taking the time to listen? And if you're going to use a tool like TINYpulse that gives you the ability to see where things are in real time, you have got to have leaders who see their behavior as important, that it would be important enough to them to listen to what's being said, to respond to what's being said, and to do it in real time, and that really becomes our benefit. And when you do that, you create a culture where associates know that how they feel and what's going on for them becomes important in terms of being understood and valued. So I'm going to kind of share this as part of our discussion today. So I've talked about some of the foundational pieces around listening and how important it becomes. The second part then becomes, what do we do with what we hear? And our colleague Megan Torres will be spending time this afternoon actually spending time talking about responding and how we respond. But I would like to end this part right before we do a couple of questions with a quote, one of my favorite quotes that says, "I'd rather come out of any relationship with both of us standing tall than for both of us to be slumped over from one person having leaned too hard and the other having let them. Healthy relationships are about supporting, not carrying. So the goal is not to fix, it is to support and provide the necessary support so that individual associates can take responsibility for their own growth and behavior with support, feeling like they're understood, valued, and listened to. So with that, I'll open it up for a couple of questions.
For the Q&A, I'm going to move to this side, just so I'm not blocking everybody on the right-hand side. Just a couple quick questions. You mentioned that leaders really needed to buy into this concept of listening. Definitely the most votes went to, what happens if some leaders aren't on board, and how do you get them on board?
Well, number one, I just need to say, I don't believe that you'll necessarily always get everyone on board. I think the question for me always becomes knowing the person, their personality, how they lead. Are they coachable or are they not coachable? If they're coachable, you put the time, energy, and focus on it. If they're not coachable, you might need to look and see whether or not you have the right person. But I do believe, and one piece I'll add to this is not only sharing transparent results, but if you really want to send the message that these things that we've talked about matter, engagement, culture, participation, those kind of things, link it to their compensation. We did, big. Link it to their compensation so that your words and your behavior go together. Those are a couple of examples.
Great. Now, regardless of your role within the organization, can you give us an idea of some resources, books, places that you would go to teach people to listen with empathy?
Gosh, I would kind of go back to there's some very basic components. Now, this kind of comes from the therapy world, but it's where a lot of the information started was Carl Rogers, who did a lot of work on what empathic listening is. And I really think when we go back to the foundational components of helping people feel understood, that a lot of his work really links into what we need to be doing organizationally.
Great. Speaking about teaching people to listen with empathy, this person wanted to know, wouldn't you just fire the person with the nail in their forehead? Don't answer that. Okay.
That's really good.
Ladies and gentlemen, Francis Roy.
Thank you.